Hello and welcome back to Modern World History. We were talking about imperialism, and in the last video we talked a little bit about the scramble of Africa, and we talked about some of the positive and negative impacts of imperialism over time. But for the most part, we look at imperialism and you think this is something that's very negative for the groups that were being exploited by, in this case, Europeans during this time period. So let's take a look at Southwest Asia. And now, sometimes some of you may know this better by the Middle East. Okay, so this right here is more of a perceptual region, but the Southwest Asia literally refers to the geographic region that we're looking at. And so we know that the Ottoman Empire was one of the strong Muslim empires that came to be in kind of your Eurasia, in your Mediterranean region. Anatolia was the peninsula where modern day Turkey is today, and that was kind of the center point for the Ottoman Empire during this time. So the Ottoman Empire had existed for a very, very long time, um, going back to the Byzantine Empire whenever they conquered Constantinople. But they were behind the times at this point. They weren't able to modernize and keep up with the Europeans that were so close to them. And so we already talked in a previous video about some of these issues. We're going to talk in a future video about how Serbia and Greece began to try to get independence from the Ottoman Empire and succeeded. And Europeans are going to also take notice of the Ottoman weaknesses. And they're going to start thinking, well, the Ottoman Empire is really weak and they control a lot of really strategic land and cool resources. And so there's a bunch of what we're going to call geopolitical advantages. Okay, so Europeans are going to want to control certain amounts of territory that belonged to the Ottoman Empire, so that they could control the trade and the political relationships of with their other rivals. That's what we mean by geopolitical. If there's a geographic advantage that could give one country a economic and political advantage over other countries, then it would be that's what we mean by a geopolitical advantage. And there's also situation factors. So when we look at situation factors, it has to do with geopolitics, but the location of where certain features in geography are can be really, really enticing. And so, for example, Russia really, really badly wanted a warm water port. And so they wanted in on the territory that was being controlled by the Ottoman Empire because it could, if they were able to control that, it could dramatically improve their development and their competition against other European countries. And so this is where you start to see this is where you start to see the issue we talked about in the previous video with the Crimean War. So it was Russia's effort to get a warm water port. They didn't expect the British and the French to come in and form an alliance against them. They actually also thought that Austria would probably assist. He thought, well, I'm sorry, the French he expected. The French was a problem. He expected the British and the Austrians to side with him. And the Austrians were neutral. The British fought against him, and other people came in and fought against the Russians as well. And so the Russians expected the Europeans to help them in the Crimean War to take the land because it could be advantageous for them as well. But France and Britain had their own agendas and did not. So this revealed even more how weak the Ottomans were because, let's face it, the Ottomans didn't do so well. I mean, they were the only ones that really lost to the Russians. The Russians were shown as weaklings and as not up to date during this war, as we already discussed. But the Ottomans really looked bad. I mean, they really looked bad. The great game was more competition between Russia and Britain over, this case, parts of India and parts of Afghanistan. And so ultimately, you're going to see where we're about to talk about Egypt and Persia. Well, those countries fell, or I guess Persia fell to both spheres of influence from the British and the Russians. But Egypt is they're going to get ahead of the game. They're going to say, kind of like Menelik with Ethiopia, the Egyptians start thinking, hey, we have a choice here. We can either modernize or we can be consumed. And so they start thinking, we need to modernize, we need European guns, we need to figure out ways we can defend against these Europeans, and the only way to do that is to become like them so they won't come in and imperialize. And so Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, but his name is the same as the boxer, Muhammad Ali is going to be the leader of Egypt, and he was sent to govern by the Ottomans, but he ends up breaking away and led an independent Egypt, part of the whole weakness of the Ottomans thing. And he ends up taking over Syria and Arabia. Now, the Arabian Peninsula is where Saudi Arabia is today, and so he was in that area. And he begins military and economic reforms in order to make Egypt's economy and look like the Europeans. And he also shifted production of crops to the cash crop cotton. All right, now this here is super strategic. They started to produce cotton at the time, kind of around the American Civil War, when King Cotton in the South, was being interrupted by fighting with the North. And at this point, there was a good, I guess, an opportunity for new markets, and Egypt is going to jump on that, as is other parts of the world. But he also was in control of this of the Suez area around the Sinai Peninsula, and so he begins the construction, or I guess Ismail, who is Muhammad Ali's grandson, began the construction of the Suez Canal, so they can kind of control the flow of trade that might come between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. And this here's a big deal, because that area was traditionally closed off by land, and to open it up would create unbelievable flow of goods, and just movement in that area that could be controlled and housed by the Egyptians. So this is a very good thing for Egypt. They can control trade through the Red Sea, but the problem here, and where they went wrong, was that the modernization that Egypt had been undertaking was really, really expensive, and Egypt couldn't pay its bills. And so the British pounced on this opportunity, because they had been loaning the money to the British, I'm sorry, to the Egyptians for these modernization projects and for the Suez Canal, and they insisted on managing the financial control over the canal due to Egypt's problems. And they used this as a pathway by which they could control Egypt as a whole by 1882. And this here is so that's the problem that they had. Even despite their efforts to modernize, they still fell short to the European exploitation. And so here's an image of the Suez Canal from your book, and it talks a little bit about the importance of this canal for trade. But basically, it gave an opportunity for goods to go across this little stretch of land here, between the Mediterranean and the Middle East, and I guess the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, without having to go all the way around the African continent or across the land there, which was kind of an obstacle. So Persia, which is modern day Iran, all right, it used to be called Persia, began selling concessions to Western powers because they needed money, like anyone else. And what we mean by concessions is they're selling land, or they're selling pieces of property that can be used for whatever purpose they wanted to use it for. And the Europeans were looking, or the British in particular, were looking to sell tobacco, or to have a concession for tobacco in Persia. So Nasser al-Din was the leader of Persia at the time and sold tobacco production to the British, which enraged local leaders, enraged them. And so they rallied behind another leader in Persia, and this here you're going to see the tobacco boycott, and so this led to a success. So Nasser al-Din ended up end up repealing the concession, so that was kind of a victory. But there was more unrest in the country after this, and weak leadership combined, which led to a new government. And it also kind of gave the British and Russians an opportunity to step in and take over. And so we see that happen as well. So you can see that, just like with the African nations, you start to see nations in the Middle East succumb to European imperialism. So in the next video, we're going to talk about South Asia. We're going to talk a little bit about India. I'll see you then.